wanted to make a brief like statement about like the dog racing thing, because I know like we've talked about it being like definitely like a political thing in some eyes, but I just want to say like Will comes at it from, you know, more of like a spectator, like enjoying the spectacle of dog racing and being present kind of and I know yesterday you kind of talked about the like Derby Lane kind of being a vessel for like human interaction and stuff like that. So we're definitely not coming at it from like any like political stance or side with it, you know, no sides are being taken. It's more just a happening. So before we get started, I'm just going to give you all a brief introduction to Will, because he has an amazing background. So he studied at the VCU Arts, where he received a BFA in photography and film in 2012. While studying there, he was a recipient of the VMFA undergraduate fellowship. In 2015, he was included in the Review Santa Fe 100 and was named as a top 50 emerging talent by Lens Culture. Since then, he has been included in various group exhibitions, such as Skyway, a contemporary collaboration at the Tampa Museum of Art, and Peripheral Vision at Candela in Richmond, Virginia. In 2018, he was featured in the annual X at the Light Factory in Charlotte, North Carolina. He received his MFA in studio art at the University of South Florida, where he was the undergraduate fellow. While completing his master's, he received the Lens Scratch Student Prize and the SPE Student Award for Innovations in Imagining. In 2019, Douglas published his first monograph, Thought Pictures You Can Feel, which is both in private and public collections. That year, he had a solo exhibition drawing on the hearts of men at Quaid Gallery and Oh, Mary, Mary, Mary at Tempest Projects. In 2020, Douglas had an exhibition of FPYCF at Space Place in Nizhal Tagal, which I hope I didn't mess that up, in Russia. Douglas continues to exhibit work both in solo and group and solo exhibitions. He's the lead preparator at MFA St. Pete and co-curator at Parallelogram Gallery. So welcome, Will Douglas. We're glad you're here.
Thanks, Diana. Yeah, like Diana said, we met, I guess it was 2017 in Paris, and we had a really good time. And I'm happy to be here. And thanks for everyone at the Lipa Ratner for, you know, helping out showing the work. It was a really good thing for me during COVID to get this work together and, you know, have a place to actually show it outside of the studio. So it was a good time to get it together. And it seems like people are still trickling in. See that Matt Wicks and Selena just got here, so that's great. But yeah, I'll get started. And let me share my screen real fast. Okay. And bear with me. I haven't been teaching online in a minute, so I'll probably be a little rusty, but okay. So where I wanted to start with, you know, the presentation, everyone can hear me okay? Everyone's good?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, cool. Where I wanted to start was kind of just, you know, where I begun making photographs. And I think that's really, you know, kind of the basis to the project is this, this space of images. But, you know, my background was in photography. You know, I studied at VCU, like Diana said, and, you know, it was a very street photography, kind of on the road photographer mentality. So I'd go out into the world, make pictures, you know, like kind of investigate spaces, which I feel like I still do today, but in a whole different way. So you know, I was really thinking about this space in Florida, and that's one of the reasons I came down to Florida, because it's always been an interest of mine, where it's been like this really foreign location, this kind of Wild West scenario. So even before, you know, I came to grad school here, I was really focused on this landscape. So, you know, even just, you know, this aerial view of like storms and surges and, you know, the elements that, you know, this kind of island feeling kind of experience. During that period of time when I was in graduate school, I really started to think about 2D and 3D, and that's something that, you know, has always been in my practice. And this is kind of one of the first works that I made where I was really challenging that space with the rectangle. I feel really confronted with this, you know, ideas like a sculptor, painter, photographer looking at the space in which, you know, this is kind of a format that everybody kind of deals with. You know, we look at these like four walls that we're kind of interacting on, and we all kind of have the same approach in the beginning, and then we start to like really refresh that through, you know, our studies or, you know, being in the studio, et cetera. So I feel like for this piece specifically was like a really good turning point for me in my practice. Then I went on to, you know, make various works that involved photographs and materials. You know, at the time I was working in a wood shop, really thinking about, you know, these commercial aspects of materials, a hierarchy of materials, and how they could provide different, you know, values within the system of making art, which, you know, is a very sculptural conversation, really basic, sculpture 101. What is the material speaking? And for me, having the photograph with the material became something I was really interested in. So it became really formulaic, where I would always, have one photograph and the material in which, we would be placing the photograph on. So the photograph always became an object within, the installation of the sculpture. It was not just a piece of paper anymore. The image interaction would become something at the surface, and then I would apply that to, the construction which I was fabricating in the studio. This is from the show Oh Mary Mary at Tempest Projects, where I was returning from Russia in the residency. I was really thinking about this icon imagery, and like placing in the corner, and how the photographs, have this relationship to the space itself. Bringing it off the wall, thinking about Malevich's black square, and these icons and the removal of icons. So like the Mary is not present here, and then kind of having a play on that. This is from another project that I was doing during COVID, where I did feel like this constraint to, make things a little bit smaller at the time, because I was working out of our garage, actually out of parallelogram during lockdown, and starting to think about the landscape in which, Florida was providing, and how I can have an interaction in that space, as well as using, this material knowledge that, I've gained, through the studio practice, and also, like I said, in the commercial practice, how those things would interact together. So the metal grate, the wood, and the photograph became really like, the three elements that I would always like try to, re-present in different ways, but, kind of having this consistency of language is something that I feel like it took me a long time to start to develop. Just treating the photographs the same way. You'll see repetition of walnut and also the photograph as well. And then, I really was kind of attracted to this, available material and this hierarchy of this idea that, we can heighten the material through, kind of like a coating. So using gold leaf and silver leaf became really interesting to me. And I think that was also thinking about these icon images that I was working with as well. Obviously the fish becoming, another surface to apply to the cardboard. Same here, dressing up the OSB, something I've used in the past, but then once again, putting this material to make it seem more valuable, but still have, the material value of the OSB, which is, the building material. Here's an installation shot of all of them together. Like I said, really working in this small scale, leaving grad school, really thinking about this idea, like what can I house, what can I keep, what can I re-show, and making works that are justifiable within that scale to still speak the language that I'm really happy about speaking. Going back to that installation at Tempest Projects, showing the OSB in relationship to the objects. Like I said, Matt's here, him and I made these pieces together, thinking about the placement of the photograph, what that means when we put it on an object itself. Once again, working collaboratively was really interesting for me too, releasing these ideas of, how I would work, and then having somebody interact with me and thinking about form, and then, this relationship to function, and then the image within that space. So most of the people that I saw that are in the crowd are pretty familiar with these. But what we did was, we drew the forms, Matt hand built them, I was taking images, and these are part of my book, and then we applied them to decals, and then we'd run with the imperfections and, use gold luster in the cracks. And that was still speaking to the language that I was using prior. Here's another one. And then, using this idea of image in repetition and doubling and mirroring. This is a silver gelatin print behind a mirror glass, so you would see your reflection in it. The documentation itself is actually hard to see, but it had kind of a 3D effect where you stand in front of it. You can never quite see yourself, and you can only focus on the image if you stare directly at it. You see your doubling of your own image in the mirror, so it became dizzying, and then you'd have to look back at the photograph. But, Cain and Abel was always a story I was really interested in as well. This, masculine story of, having to have these two brothers that were fighting once together and one died. So I always had this like kind of biblical or, art history reference in all of the work. Here too, dealing with the form, masculinity, starting to think more about sports and Olympics, and thinking about, this idea of the form of the body and how it's depicted through art history. And this image in the back was research I was doing based on tapestries and thinking about the photograph, covering the wall in such a way, but that was also dye on vinyl. Ripping apart images is something that I was really focused on, once again, this materiality of the photograph, knowing that, we can use it as a sculptural property, and it never needed to be just the image that it presented. When I documented it, it becomes part of just the language within the studio. Here as well, this is a photographic banners that I cut into squares to make this flag. So they're worn photographic banners that I collected around the city of St. Petersburg in Russia during my residence, cut them into squares and fabricated them together to make a sculpture of a checkered flag. Projection on panel. Once again, you see the OSB, the degradation of the image, and the space in which I wanted people to feel like they could walk in between the two things. That was something that everyone was really excited about video at the time, and I feel like it's something that I was really experimenting with. But I feel like it was a good breakthrough for me to see the degradation of a material in the image itself. I felt like there was always this hierarchy of the photograph to be high quality and be documented in such a way, but for me to use like a personal cell phone image and let that also pixelate and fall apart became really important. Once again, the repetition here, thinking about the domestic space in which the images would be in place, and this idea of the photograph being reproducible. That's why you also see the two casted walnuts, constantly thinking about repetition. How does that relate to sculpture? How does that relate to the photograph that we can print over and over again? And how do we put hierarchy into the sculptural object because of its superiority of its value, and then in relation to the photograph that seems a little bit more disposable. So that's why I like to play with scale in that way as well. And this was an earlier work. I'm kind of working a little bit backwards, where I just put the photograph on a piece of wood, and I just to see how that would function. So this was actually one of the first sculptural photographic pieces I made, where I had a photograph of this painting that I thought was thinking about the presentation of the photograph, but also this kind of meta version of the painting, and how does that come through when we place it on something really kind of trivial like the piece of wood as a building material. Like, how do we relook at the painting, and how does it become the photograph becomes more important. So this flash is obviously from, maybe it's not obvious, but the flash is from the photograph itself, not the documentation. And this is kind of one of the last more straight photographic pieces that I made when I was looking at, how can we flatten spaces, and how does it have this conversation with painting? Looking at glass, looking at fractured abilities, putting photographs back into, this frame, not worrying so much about the material surface that it was on. I felt like I kept doing this one line after one line and putting the photograph on top of, wood. What happens when we go back and look and make just a straight photographic image when we find this in the world? So I felt like this was a good one. I felt like it was a portrait in a way as well, looking at, the human figure through abstraction, but then, to think about scale in relationship to painting. So that's kind of just a quick background of everything that I had been doing since like 2012 to 2020, just kind of like a washover in different series. During my experience of coming to Tampa and coming to St. Petersburg, I was really interested in dog racing through just being introduced to it. It was always kind of a foreign idea for me. I know a lot of people that I've talked to from Florida, it's very part of their culture. And I had maybe in the beginning kind of a voyeuristic experience where I was really like into the procedure of going. I really liked all these different things that were occurring, the scenes, the spectacle of everything. And I became pretty invested in it and started to thinking about these dog races actually when I was in graduate school, because I lived next to the Tampa dog track and go to the satellite dog track, and having these conversations and thinking about art history. I really dove into thinking about that experience of how the dog and the greyhound specifically was depicted in art history because of its long lineage of being in one of the oldest dogs. So I'm just going to run through a couple images here of a little bit of art history images, and I feel like kind of fueled the project for me to think that it was important to kind of contribute to this historical notion of the dog. So most of these will be pretty familiar to some of you. And through this whole process too, I'm thinking about the form, the function as well, and what materials are being depicted in. I don't have all the information for all of these, but it goes really far way back, and I started to think about how can I contribute to this? If I'm that interested, it doesn't need to be sculpture, it doesn't need to be photographs. Is the dog itself very important? Edward Murbridge, of course, he did these series of dogs and horses of tracking the way in which they run as a study. So there was always this photographic history involved in this as well. So I wanted to really slow down and think like, if I'm going to make a project about dogs, like how could I do that? So William Wigman, of course, more contemporary people I'll go through here, Pierre Huey, Noel Mason, thinking about the dog too in relationship to like an aggression or a domestic space and how we're using the dog as a figure, as a sculpture, as part of an installation. Jake Troy, John Bird. John Bird was one of the major people that I studied with at USF2, and his relationship to the Greyhounds was really interesting to me. And he's always been a contributor to this project in my head too. He's given me a lot of good fuel as I worked through the project. So obviously, the project that you guys have seen is about Derby Lane, and it's in St. Petersburg, and I live really close to it now. I always liked this like arena attraction to this space, and as you go deeper into this idea of Derby Lane, I kind of pulled back the layers of where it was in popular culture as well. One of the first places that I saw Derby Lane was in Ocean's 11, and I kind of it washed over me a little bit. I really didn't quite think about it in the way that I do now, and thinking about this space of these two characters, running away to a location to kind of hide away, participate in something. Someone had to, Brad Pitt's character had to go down there here to find somebody that was trying to run away. And I kind of like that narrative of the story. This there's a place that is of the past where people are still participating, but it has this nostalgia value. So through my research, obviously, like finding different images that have to do with the track itself. So kind of a awesome thing that happened during COVID as well. I'm already kind of in this project thinking more and more. My uncle spent time in Tampa, and he studied at USF as an undergrad, took a couple classes, and took a photography class and sent me all these images of the Tampa. So I decided to use these images as fuel and look through them. And they're black and white silver gelatin prints, and it was kind of like a good trigger for me to continue going within this project. It was only 5 photographs that he sent me, and I looked through them. I started to think about their gestures. They all seemed very like nostalgic and poetic, and I was looking at art history like I always do in relationship to images that he sent me, and I was starting to see these figures that looked like other figures that I was really interested in. These postures and poses like were really dramatic, and I was really starting to find connections within them, and maybe forcing connections, but I found like it really helped me feel like maybe there's something here with the dog track stuff. So some of this might be familiar to you guys, maybe some of it's not. But one of the spaces in which in the images I saw were the tickets on the ground. They were really repetitive throughout everything. So I really like, well, if it's not about the people to me anymore, because there's like this vacancy of these spaces, I don't want to I'm not necessarily interested in photographing the dogs. The tickets are this like monumental part and experience of the race. So I started collecting them. I'd been collecting them for quite some time, always losing tickets. And, when the dog track was closing, I decided that it was really important that I went to the specific, closure of the race. All the work became quite watered down prior to that. So I had tickets from like 2015 to when I moved down here to, 2020 when the track closed. And I decided to really focus specifically on the tickets from, that last race. Once again, looking at Matisse's cutouts, thinking about how they can function in this sort of way, just looking at formal qualities of the ticket. And I thought that was something that's always been working very strong formalist. And I really think that, shapes and color and form drive a lot of the work. Although there's content in there, I've always really concentrated on how does it function aesthetically. That's always been something really important to me. So looking at, this Matisse and, being around cyanotypes, there's a lot of people working within that medium in the Tampa Bay area. I kind of looked back and like looking at these bluer ones and thinking about how I can transform this material. I was making drawings at the time, the beginning of the tickets, and decided that it'd be better to see them presented in the cyanotype form. So the first ones I made were scattered on the ground and trying to like reincorporate this idea that like where I found them. So I was calling these confetti prints in the beginning. And, I was really excited about them. I was making a lot of them and really thinking about how they function, looking down at the ground. But I didn't feel like I was transforming the material enough. I thought, or the content enough. I feel like I was just putting it right back into the space in which I found it, which is something that was interesting, but I feel like it wasn't giving the significance of the individual bet or the gambler that I thought that was the most interesting part is that they were losing tickets. So it once again got kind of watered down. So I started, going through like my inventory. This is like, I don't know, 100th of what I had. Like I gathered all the tickets at the end of the races and I have bags full of them in the studio, and some of them are in good condition. Some of them are crumpled, as you can see here. Some of them are flat. So I printed lots of these. They're very forensic in the beginning, really straightforward on cyanotype paper, not the cutups that you now see in the gallery. They were just printed blue, and I felt that there was something being lost here as I did this. Although I liked them, I still like the names of the dogs that I titled them with. I liked looking at the numbers, but I felt like it became more of a scientific study than a more experiential, physical object. So once I moved on, I started like looking deeper into the numbers, looking at gestures that are happening on pieces of paper. As you can see at the bottom here, people are taking notes on, the programs and stuff like that. So I was starting to pay attention a lot to details that were going on in that. And something that I really wanted to, focus on was, and you can, Jules is just got it. But I could, wanted to think back to like the program itself is like this object. And this is one of the first cutouts that I made. It kind of encapsulated everything that I was interested in: the dog's names, the gesture on the book, and then also the physicality of the object itself. So I decided that, I'll cut this one out, I'll look at it, I'll study it. And, the title Daily Double was really interesting to me. So there's all these like formal things that were happening within the space that I thought was, when I call space, but the objects that I'm looking at that was like really important to me. And it says unique cyanotype. And that was something that I decided in the practice too, that I wanted them all to be unique. So as I began to cut them out in the studio, I was only making one of each. I decided that like the individual bet and individual gambler, there's a lost ticket, a lost bet, that, the ticket should function as like a memory of that or a relic of that situation that happened. So I'll go through some of the work that's in the exhibition now that if you had the opportunity to see it, was in the show. So there'll be the object itself and then the title is afterwards. And the titling, is just the name of the dogs in which that were bet on at the time. Some of the bets I, have longer titles because there's 10 dogs that were bet on, and this became also a really conceptual game for me. I feel like that's the way that I started to put the dogs back into the objects themselves, because this balled up piece of paper, the number doesn't really signify anything to people that are just coming into kind of blind, but this idea that the title of the dog and the name of the dog presents, more of a, I guess for me, like a more humble experience and understanding that, there's this animal that we are betting on. And, they became more crushed, more folded. I was really more interested in especially through the printing process and becoming, I think, better at, using the cyanotype process. I found these midtones and this beauty of the process that I wanted to really depict that I felt like I couldn't necessarily do unless there was, this fractured surface within the image. And still just, looking at them, I light them sometimes when I photograph them. It's just on a wall, I or I do them on the ground, depending on how I want the shadows to be casted. So it's a studio-based process. The tickets are only 3 inches by 3 inches, and then I blow them up to 16 by 18. Some of them I get a little bit bigger, but they're still relatively, in between the 16 by 28 inch range, but I'm blowing them up, much larger than their actual size. Once again, really looking at numbers, the note taking, it was very foreign to me when I started this body of work, but then it became much more interesting to me, and I could kind of read the codes a little bit more, thinking about the dogs that were being bet on, the language. And I know that, this says palm, so it was a different track, these things, but being really interested in this idea of drawing. And that's something that I've always loved about the cyanotype process as well, that it really does appear to be a drawing process, although it's a printing process. I think it could really, confuse the viewer. And that's something that I think that, going back to looking at my beginning images is really important to me, where the object itself becomes, kind of cross medium. It's not necessarily about photography or printmaking or drawing. It's, it has these kind of crossovers between all of them. And then kind of going back to thinking about, perspective and the state in which, people are finding them and losing them, I started dealing with depth of field a little bit more, kind of a nerdier photographic, concept, thinking about, if we see these, like you don't always see them on the ground. You don't always find them when they're in like complete clarity. Maybe, when you're at the race, you might be, drunk, drinking cheap vodka or whatever it may be. And like, you're passing through and you're seeing them. And I felt like, I wanted that to be depicted in some of these. I didn't want them to all seem so sober and straightforward and, easy to read. And I felt like that investigation became more interesting to me as well. Another one here, Bryson folds, and just really pushing, the process. When they're on the wall, they're float mounted in the frame, so they have a more three-dimensional feel. There's a shadow casted behind them. They seem very flat and scanned when you see them digitally, but having them, appear as if they're coming off the surface. The piece of paper itself is flat, but by adding like, a quarter inch to have them float off the frame itself, does give this depth. You can see it a little bit here. Once again, going into note taking. This is actually one of the only ones that I've seen where people actually recorded the names of the dogs. Normally it's based in numbers. The gambler doesn't necessarily care. I mean, maybe they do care based on their bets of the dog's name, but they're always recording the numbers of the dogs that they're going to put the bet on. And you can see the 1, 2, 2, thinking about the place in which they're going to be betted on. And I really like that idea that, once again, putting the title of the dog or the name of the dog back into the piece. And these are still some of my favorites that I've made, and I want to make these a little bit larger, but having this list, having like this knowledge and this code in association to the tickets themselves, I feel like is kind of like a guide throughout the show. So you can kind of come back and look, and I've printed both sides of the final race, looking at the wagering, the statistics, and all these things. So maybe it's this key that you can go back through and look at the tickets that were presented through the objects themselves. So I'm getting kind of towards the end here, but after the anniversary of the race, or on the anniversary of the race, Derby Lane was nice enough to let me come back and rephotograph. Thinking about closure of the project, how to continue, 1 year later, looking at the track, and they allowed me to come back and make more pictorial pieces. So within the show itself, I felt like it was this, this empty vessel that I had the opportunity to revisit and be able to, investigate this space through more of a documentary, like photographic lens, but within the same presentation of the cyanotype, but also like the framing process, et cetera. So like having this consistency through the language. The ticket window, being very important to the other objects that I was creating, thinking that now I was on the other side of the window looking at it as if I was the selling the programs. Using more collage and digital montage, and then through the printing process, once again, these more vacant spaces. This is a kennel, and then the TV from the vet's room that looks out on the track. And then through that process, being in the studio, presents interesting opportunities. I had all these negatives around. This was actually a negative for the print that's behind me. Needed to be reworked, and I through like this financial part of making these, they become really expensive based on like each negative becomes, a wasted negative becomes, this monetary value. And I was starting to think about those images being present in the body of work, this, negative, that conceptual idea of, how we're looking at things, but also like this space of red, white, and blue within the series, where I feel like, the dog racing became such an Americana thing that I started to really see like the American flag in the studio. So presenting the red in relationship to the blue, the cyanotype, I feel like was a nice, kind of note within that to make us reconsider these colors kind of on a very primary level. So through that too, presenting and I guess I kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but for those who don't know, like the red part is the negative in which I'm making the blue. Like this is the, the positive result of the image before, right? We have the red that blocks off the light, and then you get the presentation of the cyanotype on the paper. So giving them both the same hierarchy within the studio and wondering how they function together, right? So you've seen this repetition again from this image and that presentation in the paper, and then back again. So, having that kind of language that I was having in the beginning that I showed you guys of representing things and re-looking. So this is a camera that looks at the track on the lead out, and they are getting weighed. And then this is the kennel, you know, a year later after the track is closed overground. So here's a ticket. And I was also thinking about this space and like, how can I interject on that once again, using plexiglass like I did previously, and like putting a film in something in front of something and having to look through. And I think this image did well because the backside of the paper was already present through that. So it was already happening, you know, to fight to see the numbers in reverse. So to be able to stare through the plexiglass to have, you know, this red penetration that, you know, was right on the surface, and like maybe it presents a negative connotation on Derby Lane, or maybe it just makes us think about the negatives that we're using to make the cyanotypes themselves. So looking back at work that I was making for the Tempest show, I was like, that language kept reappearing, and kind of thinking about my ideas of, you know, the form, you know, of the body relationship to the spectacle, thinking about, you know, the competition of strength, thinking about animals. Going back to the other show that I did at Tempest, thinking about my interest in bullfighting that was in 2018, where I was constantly already interested in this, you know, this spectacle that was happening within, you know, animals, and something that I've read about and looked at. So like, it kind of resurfaced itself through the dog track, thinking about, you know, the sense of control and constraint that, you know, we're presenting within the ring for the spectators. So, you know, this is an image from the last day of races, thinking about, you know, where does the person come into play here? And obviously we're masked up because of, you know, COVID, and looking at these dogs who are also, you know, having this sort of constraint. And the muzzle has always been something that I thought that was, you know, part of this whole process became, you know, humans' ability or drive and desire to control the animal. And, you know, I know that they have aggression against one another. That's one of the reasons why they have them wear them. But, you know, this, you know, the function of the muzzle and its, you know, signification for control of the dog. So when we adopted my dog, you know, I had these muzzles that were given to us to have her wear, and it became, you know, this object of power over the dog. And I really thought that was something I should like look at and consider. And formally, I really like the way that they, you know, function within the cyanotype, but I also think that, you know, it's a pretty big signifier for the sport itself. You know, like our dog doesn't wear one of these within the home. You know, people that I know, that other people that know greyhounds, they don't, you know, muzzle their dog in the house. It's become, you know, part of the sport, removed into the domestic space. And number 34 was her number that when she came off the farm. So, you know, this idea of identity too, from, you know, coming from the space of either the farm to the track, or from the farm to the domestic space, and how that can transform, you know, their personality based on like the language that you use to them, you know, how we call them a number or we call them a name. And then this is my second to last slide, but this is just kind of a still from the last race. So this is the last exit of the dogs coming out of the gate. So I took a video of them, and just because of Zoom's sake, I did not want to stream a video, but, you know, it's through this repetition of them coming out the gate over and over again that I feel like has a presence within the tickets as well. You know, we constantly watch this thing occur, this economy occur, that, you know, finally, like this last time that the gate is open, that it's no longer. Yeah, so this is my last slide, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I absolutely love this Bart Simpson photo. We talked about this yesterday, and I was so happy that you chose to end with it today. I don't know if anyone here like has questions already. I have some that I'm happy to ask, but I'd love to give the audience a chance before I hop in.
Sure.
Nobody? All right, I can start. So one of the things like I found interesting was like the notion of like confetti, like how initially, like when you were starting this project, you called the tickets like confetti, and like typically like confetti is used in like celebrations and like things where people are winning, but the tickets that you were collecting were losing tickets, right? So I think it's like an interesting thing that you like celebrate the loss that people had like while they were like within this space. And I just wonder like what you think was gained as people lost.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the whole project's about losing. And that's something that I feel that maybe is not always so obvious, but this idea that, you know, all the tickets are losing. In the end, one could say that, the people that own the track lost because, of voting and its closure. It's up for debate, but I do think that, having this like celebration of loss was really interesting to me. And I started actually making those again and revisiting them in a little bit differently, creating more form and, seeing if we can make it more activated. But yeah, I think that celebrating loss is really interesting. I think that's the only reason, the track kept going, because people kept losing and this desire to win was always there. If everyone won all the time, it probably wouldn't be there anymore. And that's, through a lot of my practice, it's about failure and fracture. And I think that although the printing process becomes really romantic and beautiful for the tickets, it's always about, the lost wage, this like loss of, hope, I guess. I mean, like, people like go to the ticket to hopefully win something, to like buy something afterwards, or give themselves a better experience with the money. But the losing keeps them coming back. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, just in general, like gambling is that same thing, they've got to keep you like hooked and coming back. My next question has to do with Jules, who, those of you who haven't met her, is like such a sweet little sweet potato. I've met her a few times. I don't know if she's there to say hello.
Behind me.
The infamous studio hound. I wondered if she was, I can't remember the timeline of you getting Jules, and so I was wondering if getting her was more of a catalyst and like a fuel behind like your curiosity behind this, because I know you pretty much started this in 2015, like, so.
Yeah, I mean, no. So the race and all this stuff like happened before that, and then Noelle wanted to get a greyhound, and I was like, I don't know, like I really think this might be a lot of work, but I love them. And I was like, all right, we almost took our name off the list, all this stuff, and then we got to adopt them, and our Jules, and it was great. But no, I'd already been working on it for a while, and in grad school I had ideas, and I know I talked to Sarah about them for a while too, about making some sculptures of some greyhounds, and it just never came to anything. And I just kind of thought, like, put it on the back burner, and then we'd always go drink beers at the dog track for $1, and I collected stuff. And so I was making drawings, and they just weren't any good, and I just like kept going back and thinking about how to like use this as a project. So yeah, the dog was like, I constantly see her, so it's a reminder. And like, and she's like this walking residue of the industry, so I can't help but not think about it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, for me, it's more about my experience with the track and having it being gone. It was like really romantic and kind of sad in a way when it ended, because I feel like it had this fuel behind it that I was like critiquing but experiencing and like enjoying, but had this complicated experience. So yeah, she was just an addition to all of that, and a good one. I think that it's definitely made me like kind of look at the industry, and every time I take her outside, people have some sort of story about dog racing. So
mm-hmm. Yeah, she's so quiet and like meek, and it's funny to me because it's like your notion of like identity of like people as well as like dogs functioning, like we kind of talked about, like a dog on their normal day to day, like no dog naturally is gonna like just I mean, they get the zoomies, like, but they're not gonna like race like that naturally. So like the context of like the identity of the greyhound on the track during their career versus off the track, or even that like in between, because I if I'm correct, like Jules she didn't race, but she was on like a farm to race, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, on that note, I mean, she wants to run, she loves running, but just not as much as they wanted her to run. Yeah, she was like a reject. And if anybody wants to get a greyhound, I would tell them go for a reject. They're kind of the best. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's a complicated situation. And there's people in our neighborhood that also have greyhounds, and their dogs race. And there's obviously this, different issues. And a lot of people that are from Florida I see people's names on here, have experienced other friends with dogs or with greyhounds, and they know there's complications based on the ones that have made it to the track and ones that haven't. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, we were there to unload all the dogs and help out. I think Matt's not here anymore. He must have got off, but he helped us unload the dog. It was quite an experience to just see the whole process of like how they bring them back into domestic space. It's very raw. I was happy to be there and be able to help and experience it all the way through versus just like fostering.
Mm-hmm. What do you, so I know you like, you've been really interested in like materials, like through your work, like just in general, like through the years. And I was, like the materials of like, these are kind of really interesting because it's almost like it starts as like a ready-made because you're using a lot of like tickets and stuff that are there, but then you're also like using your own imagery and also changing like the identity of these by presenting them in a different way. And I wondered just about like dogs as material, like you talked about like dogs as like numbers and kind of like that notion, but I didn't know if you thought about like them as a material kind of like within this process.
Yeah, I mean, I think about them as like an idea of a form, and I think that's maybe one of the reasons that like the only image I really have of the dog is in that painting of the dogs, and I feel like the whole process or the whole project is about the absence of the dog because the racing's gone, and like I want people to have curiosity about where the dog is now and these dogs and like where they are and like, the life after the track. I've obviously looked at depicting the dogs, and I've made a couple photographs of Jules, and they just never presented quite what I was interested in. This like I'm more interested in a quiet poeticism versus like, here's the dog now, they're everything's fine, here they are. And I want people to investigate a little bit more, but I think having that long absence and like desire to find out where they are will hopefully present more questioning. And I like the idea of a project that isn't concluded necessarily with through like all these straightforward answers. So I think that's maybe one of the reasons. I mean, you saw the video of the dog at the end, but you don't see them after that race.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of a good segue into like my next question, which was how are you going to use like this information using like for like going forward and further explorations of similar things.
So I'm actually in the process of making more sculptural things. I'm making some muzzles and some glass Kongs with Matt, and working on
Did you
doing
say
some.
Kong?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I'm really interested in this idea of going kind of back to the muzzle and like why we would give an object to a dog, or to constrain them again. Like it's to occupy their time. It's to make sure that they have something to be interested in to distract them. And then I'm also making bronze muzzles. So like the muzzle once again to present this idea of constraint, but all to put it into a dysfunctional object, because it becomes a sculpture of this property that's heavy, but also to think about the dogs gnawing on the glass, or like the muzzle being this weighted object made of bronze on the dog. I feel like puts this conceptual backing into this material. So those are kind of my focuses within this project right now. And then I'm working on Selena, I think, asked that I'm actually working on a book. I found someone to write about it, which is really exciting, but just starting to sequence and think about how these things can be in a linear fashion versus through an installation property, and like how I can kind of control that a little bit more. It's been a couple of years since I've made a book. So yeah, I do think about that and how to conclude that. And I've talked to Derby Lane about, helping me out and revisiting the space again and kind of see that evolution, if that's important or not, or just have it be like 1 year or that specific day, all the labor that went into making those tickets. And then 1 year later, maybe that's enough, but that's something I'm trying to figure out.
Cool. I'm excited to continue to follow this. I think the evolution of it is going to be cool, and it'll be cool to see like your cyanotypes within the space of these like also sculptural objects. I think that will definitely add to it.
Me too. I can't wait to see. It's been a lot of planning. They're expensive to make, so I've been really plotting it out.
Yeah. Well, I think that's pretty much all I've got on my end with questions and stuff. I don't know if there's anything else that anyone else wanted to add or ask, or should we just end this with like a nice video of Jules behind you? Bring her.
Yeah, she's hunkered down. This is kind of the daily. She won't leave my side while I'm here. So yeah, I appreciate everyone coming, and there's a lot of familiar names on the list of people that are here. So thank you. I look forward to talking more with you guys about the project.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep. Thanks, Diana.
Yep. Have a great night. We will see you soon. And Will, I'm hopeful that we'll have new things coming with this soon. So keep us all in the loop.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you guys. Have a good night, everyone.